watching the Debka File, a weekly roundup of exclusive news, insight, and analysis of the Middle East, broadcast to you live from the heart of the region. Coming up on the program today, Israel's changed tactic in Syria after U.S. troop withdrawal announcement. U.S. trade-off for Russia, take northeastern Syria but downgrade Iranian presence. Iran hands Syria over to 5 new local proxies. And now to our top headlines. U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton arrived in Israel this weekend to meet with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over the U.S. troop withdrawal from Syria and other pressing issues. Netanyahu said this past week that the new reality set out by the Trump administration includes Israel managing a military campaign on Iran, while the U.S. manages the economic side with sanctions over the Islamic Republic. Until now, Israel has relied on the U.S. military presence as a shield for holding back the Russians, Iranians, and Syrians. The removal of the shield, even if spread over some months, is a blow to Israel, both tactically and psychologically, as it now has to prepare for a solo operation versus Iran in the Syrian arena. As such, according to Debka, the U.S. military drawdown from Syria makes Israel's freedom of action in Syrian and Lebanese airspace against the Iranian threat more essential than ever before. It is clearly understood in Washington and Jerusalem that Israel will have to seek better understandings with Moscow in order to keep its air force in action over the skies of Syria, Lebanon, and possibly Iraq.
Right on your border, we have the problem of the conflict in Syria. We're going to be discussing the President's decision to withdraw, but to do so from northeast Syria in a way that makes sure that ISIS is defeated and is not able to revive itself and become a threat again, and to make sure that the defense of Israel and our other friends in the region is absolutely assured, and to take care of those who have fought with us against ISIS and other terrorist groups.
We'll go up to the Golan Heights, again, depending on the weather. The Golan Heights is tremendously important for our security, and I think that when you're there, you'll be able to understand perfectly why we'll never leave the Golan Heights and why it's important for that all countries recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. I've discussed this with the President, and I hope I have a chance to show it directly to you tomorrow on our visit. And if we can't fly there, I'll say it again to you.
According to Debka, in a briefing to reporters flying with him, Bolton disclosed the issues that topped his talks with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Sunday. Mainly, he said he would confirm that there is no timetable for the American pullout for Syria, which President Donald Trump announced last month. Bolton said he would emphasize that no decision has been taken on the departure of American troops from the base at Al-Tanf near the Syrian borders with Iraq and Jordan. Debka's military sources add that while the U.S. drawdown from northern Syria is definite, its departure from the strategic Al-Tanf base is not, depending on a U.S. deal with Russia. Its handover to Moscow is contingent on certain Russian commitments, the most pressing being a pledge to bar the crossings of Iranian or pro-Iranian forces between Iraq and Syria. Additionally, conditions pertain to southern and western Syria and the borders with Israel and Jordan. However, according to Debka, both Israel and Jordan oppose in principle the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Al-Tanf. Jordan fears the encroachment of Iranian or proxy groups into the kingdom, which would pose an imminent threat to its national security. Meanwhile, Israel has no faith in any Russian promises for keeping Syria's borders clear of enemy troops. 6 months ago, when the Syrian army with Russian air support seized control of rebel-held positions along the Israeli border, Moscow guaranteed to keep the Iranian military presence at bay in messages that were also addressed to Washington. Yet, at this very moment, Iranian and Hezbollah forces are parked no more than 5 kilometers from Israel's Golan border. The Abu Diab Brigade has just set up a command base at Tal al-Hara, which overlooks wide areas of the Golan, including the line of IDF defense positions, and is 12 kilometers from the Israeli border village of Alonei Bashan. This brigade is made up of Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Al-Quds officers, Hezbollah fighters, and Iraqi pro-Iranian Shiite militiamen, all of them disguised in Syrian military uniforms and carrying Syrian army IDs. As such, Debka's sources also reveal that nothing was agreed regarding Moscow's compliance with its former undertakings in the conversation Netanyahu and President Vladimir Putin held on Friday. Neither was progress made in their discussion on terms for Israel Air Force flights over Syria. This issue is critical since all of southern Syria along the Israeli and Jordanian borders, including the U.S. garrison at Al-Tanaf, are within range of the S-300 Air Defense Battalion, which Russia deployed at Deir ez-Zor in the first week of December. It is therefore hard to see how John Bolton will be able to allay Israeli and Jordanian concerns about the dangers ensuing from the departure of U.S. troops. Additionally, according to Debka, the National Security Advisor will also raise with the Prime Minister a matter that is of high concern to Washington, namely the penetration of Chinese technology in Israel and direct investment by China in the country, particularly in the port of Haifa, where the Shanghai International Port Group, SIPG, has won a 25-year contract for operating a new harbor. Additionally, the roles of the Chinese telecommunications company Huawei Technologies and Ltd. And ZTE Corp will also be brought up. After meeting Netanyahu, Bolton will head for Turkey. He and U.S. Secretary of State Michael Pompeo will be crisscrossing the Middle East over the next week. Pompeo will be visiting 8 countries, including Egypt and Saudi Arabia. When U.S. President Donald Trump told his cabinet this past week that the drawdown of U.S. troops from Syria would happen over a period of time, he did not elaborate since, according to Debka, his administration is in the middle of secret negotiations to determine the fate of Syria after the withdrawal.
Yeah, I never said fast or slow.
What's your timetable? When do you want troops to be out?
I know somebody said 4 months, but I didn't say that either. I'm getting out. We're getting out of Syria. Look, we don't want Syria. Obama gave up Syria years ago when he didn't violate the red line. I did when I shot 59 missiles in, but that was a long time later. And when President Obama decided not to violate his statement that never crossed the red line, and then they did, and he didn't do anything about it.
U.S. Arab Sunni Gulf partners are already beginning to remold Syria's post-U.S. pullback, and if ongoing feelers and discussions pan out and ripen into an understanding, a U.S.-Russian deal may emerge. According to Debka, the deal would settle along the following lines. The Americans would mobilize a Sunni Arab military, political, and economic presence for Syria opposite Iranian influence, while the Russians force Iran to pare down its military profile in the country and ultimately remove itself. The prime mover pushing the pieces back and forth between Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin is U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton. He is the highest-ranking American visitor to be seen in Moscow recently. Additionally, according to Debka's Washington sources, Trump has assigned Secretary of State Mike Pompeo as point man with the U.S. intelligence community, in which prominent voices continue to accuse Moscow of helping Trump's 2016 election victory. Pompeo served as former director of the Central Intelligence Agency and is undertaking the delicate task of keeping relations between the intelligence community and the White House on an even keel. This arrangement drew a puzzled comment from Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov last month when he said in an interview, "I haven't spoken to him," meaning Pompeo, "in a long time." He added, "I have the impression that he doesn't even handle foreign policy towards Russia anymore. If it would be different, he'd know that we need to meet and talk. Dealing with the Russians has obviously been delegated to John Bolton." According to Debka, Lavrov appeared to be fishing for confirmation that Bolton was Trump's credible emissary. This information is vitally important as the Kremlin and the White House make their way towards an understanding on Syria. While Trump's announcement of the U.S. troop withdrawal from Syria sent shockwaves throughout the U.S., Europe, and the Middle East, the Kremlin seemed to take it in stride. The day after the announcement, Putin commented that Trump had got it right when he said that ISIS had been defeated and withdrawal was the right thing to do. He also stressed that meanwhile not a single American soldier had left the country, indicating that Russia was skeptical and aware that the U.S. pullout would stretch and advance in stages. According to Debka's sources, careful choreography guides these stages. The first centers on the northern Syrian town of Manbij. Whoever controls this town will be able to cross the Euphrates 30 kilometers away and take control of the eastern bank of Syria. This week, Syrian government forces and a sprinkling of Russian Spetsnaz, or Special Forces officers, moved into position on the southern outskirts of Manbij to await developments, while large-scale Turkish forces stood on the border not far from Manbij, ready for orders from Ankara to march on the city. Their allies, Turkish-backed Syrian Turkoman militia fighters, are ready to move in from the town of Arima, 30 kilometers from Manbij. The town itself, however, is currently occupied by U.S. Marine units and Kurdish YPG militia forces. Ankara failed to obtain approval to move forward from either Washington or Moscow. Manbij is therefore hemmed in by conflicting armies, and an incautious step by any one of them could spark a bloody showdown.
طبعا الحوار جاري مع الحكومة السورية بعودة الوفد الروسي إلى منطقة العريمة، وأيضا تواجد الجيش السوري على مناطق التماس الشريط الحدودي. طبعا لا يوجد أي تواجد في المدينة للجيش السوري، إنما فقط تواجدهم على مناطق الشريط الحدودي، مناطق التماس مع درع الفرات.
U.S. President Donald Trump's remarks to his cabinet in the White House this past week were surprising and inconsistent, to say the least, mainly because he held key connecting links back, Debka reports. In his comments, Trump said that Iran is no longer the same country and that it was pulling its people out of Syria and Yemen. The president added that Iran can do what it wants in Syria, frankly. His statements indicated that due to reinstated U.S. sanctions, Iran no longer has the money to maintain forces in Syria and has to pull them out.
So Syria was lost long ago. It was lost long ago. And besides that, we're talking about sand and death. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about, vast wealth. We're talking about sand and death.
But according to Debka sources, the U.S. president did not reveal that as he spoke, his predictions of Iranian pullouts were playing out in Baghdad, 10,000 kilometers away, although for unrelated reasons. Debka sources report that the liaison officers of Iran's Al-Quds Brigade were informing heads of Iraq's pro-Iranian Shiite militias that numbers of Iranian officers and advisors would be leaving their country and returning home. The reason for this was less due to U.S. sanctions, however, and more due to other events. Mainly, according to stories published in Iraqi media the past few weeks, senior government ministers in Baghdad are accused of conniving with the two most prominent pro-Iranian militias to steal hundreds of millions of dollars from their departments and handing the money over to Qasem Soleimani, commander of Iran's Middle East forces. The guilty militias are the Popular Mobilization Units, a private army of some 150,000 soldiers under the command of Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, and the Asaib al-Alaq, which is headed by Qais al-Khazali, both in the pocket of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. Soleimani is accused of using the stolen money to fund the establishment of 5 new Syrian militias loyal to Iran, as well as injection for Hezbollah's operations in Syria and Lebanon. In addition, Debka sources reveal that Iran's interest in Syria is waning, and the Gulf and the Arabian Sea and the Indian subcontinent are gaining in importance. Tehran grasped with the USS John C. Stennis Carrier Strike Group was deployed last December opposite Iran's Gulf shores for a multiple mission. The move, Debka reports, was more than to act as a deterrent against Iran's nuclear-capable ballistic missiles test. The U.S. warships also have their gaze fixed on the strategic new Iranian Chabahar port on its southeastern coast of the Gulf of Oman, whose operations were taken over by India in late December. According to Debka, an Iranian official has said that the state-owned India Ports Global Ltd. had been granted a temporary 18-month lease followed by a 10-year period. This event has monumentous geopolitical connotation for the region and for U.S. interests. Inaugurated last year, the Chabahar port on the Indian Ocean was built largely by India. It will provide a key supply route for Afghanistan while allowing India to bypass rival Pakistan to trade with Central Asia. Therefore, the U.S. now has a bone to pick with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Trump did not grant India a waiver from sanctions against Iranian oil, only to find Modi building Chabahar port, through which India could help Tehran beat U.S. sanctions. And, according to Debka, India's control of the key port also threatens the U.S. administration's strategy for Afghanistan. Iran has found in India a partner for disrupting Trump's plans to pull U.S. forces out of Afghanistan. With us to discuss the U.S. troop withdrawal from Syria and its repercussions are Dr. Nir Bohms, expert on Middle East affairs from the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University, and Major General in the Reserves Gershon HaKohen from the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
So, with every day that passes since the U.S. troop withdrawal announcement, we are seeing new developments in the country. Can you comment on what's taking shape in Syria given these latest developments? Dr. Bohms, let's start with you.
Well, Adar, what's happening in Syria is, in a way, an end of a chapter. In some ways, the end of the Syrian war. We've seen the takeover of the vast majority of the country by President Assad. We've seen the return of Assad into the international community, into the Arab League. We've seen recent diplomatic visits in Syria. We've seen a growing understanding on behalf of all those involved, his allies and others who have not been his allies, that the fait accompli is that Assad controls Syria. But on the other hand, the Syria of 2019 is not the Syria that we knew before the war. It's a different Syria with different stakeholders. It's a Syria in where we see more Iranian troops, including entrenched within the ranks of the Syrian military. It's a Syria that has other militias rotating. Of course, the war against ISIS is not completely over, but some of these remnants of the war brings incentives for other players like Turkey to control parts of the territories, and now thinking about controlling more in the north. The Idlib is not done yet, and therefore there are some other chapters. These chapters are not supposed to change the fate of Assad or the fate of Syria, but the Iran question in particular pose a very significant question because this entrenchment and the attempts of the Iranians to establish additional presence in Syria and create a stronger axis that stretches from Iran, Iraq, Syria and Lebanon poses the feasibility of continuing escalation and certainly for this country the danger of a third Lebanese war.
Okay. Great. Gershon, I'll ask the same question to you. What do you make of the latest developments in Syria?
First of all, about Israel, I'm finding with the United States withdrawal a kind of opportunity, but let's speak about that later. First of all, what is really important to emphasize is the fact that after 7 years of civil warfare, with the expectations of some experts that borders of Sykes-Picot will collapse, at the end they found to be still relevant. The very great happiness of meeting between Iraqi militias and Syrian troops and other troops supported Assad in the border between Syria and Iraq just made the statement that these international borders from the early 20th century is still relevant. And this bringing back a kind of alert to the Israeli demand for the Golan Heights.
Now, U.S. President Trump made some unusual comments this past week, mainly that Iran is pulling its troops out of Syria, and also he said something along the lines of, frankly, can do whatever it wants in Syria. What do you make of these comments? And since the announcement, have we heard... what do you make of these comments, first of all? Let's start with that. Dr. Boms.
Well, President Trump is known to make all sorts of comments and tweets, and the first thing you need to make out of these comments is you need to wait a little bit to understand what's the reality of on the ground. However, when President Trump speaks about withdrawing of the presence of the American troops, about 2,300 or so from Syria, and if you join that to the broader trend in American policy, foreign policy, certainly under President Trump, withdrawing from international agreements, whether it is the Iran deal arrangement with the Chinese and others, and making America great again, we're not entirely surprised, and that's despite of the attempts by National Security Advisor Bolton, recent statements here that it's not going to happen so quickly. I think President Trump says that the American troops needs to be first and foremost at home. He's not interested in fighting foreign wars. I don't think that he is reluctant to continue a more assertive line vis-a-vis Iran. And the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu had said just a couple of days ago that the sort of division of labor is that the United States will fight on the diplomatic front with sanctions, and Israel will continue what it had done in the last 5 years at this point, is to continue to fighting the Iranian presence on the ground. We've sorties, Air Force and otherwise, that aimed at dismantling Iranian infrastructure in Syria, also in Lebanon, and in that sense, if needed, elsewhere.
Okay, well, you've mentioned Iran, and since the announcement, we've heard from many analysts about who the main beneficiaries of the troop withdrawal are. So, Gershon, I'd like to hear from you. What is your take on this? Who are the main countries to benefit from the U.S. exit?
It is an opportunity, and it is important to realize who are in Israel those who are emphasizing their anxiety from the United States withdrawal. The anxiety, the Israeli anxiety, is based upon the expectations that we can go on to create a kind of an order in the Middle East. Meanwhile, Israel will take new risk with new withdrawal from Judea and Samaria, by the American intervention that will give support and security for Israel. This is a dream. I don't want to be protected here by United States troops, not by international troops. And take, for example, we must examine the example of General John Allen with his program that Israel will withdraw from Judea and Samaria, and American soldiers and international forces will make inspection that the Palestinian state will be demilitarized. I don't want that. I cannot trust that. It could never really work as it was never worked with UNIFIL in Lebanon. Therefore, I really like what was said by Trump in his visit to Iraq in Christmas. And if I would have been an Israeli leader, I would embrace his word when he said to Israel, I paid to you $4 billion a year, do the best with it, what you want else. For me, I want from the American not to intervene too much, just to support Israel, to give Israel a kind of freedom for action, and not to demand Israel to make another withdrawal from Judea and Samaria or Golan Heights. These are the main two Israeli interests, more important than the interest that the Iranian will go away from Syria.
Well, thank you very much for speaking with us, Dr. Nir Bohms and Major General in the Reserves Gelshen HaKohen. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's all for this week's edition of the Debka File. We'll be back with you next week for more exclusive news, insight, and analysis. Make sure to check out our page at Israel English News and our website. I'm Madar Gravelazi. Thanks for watching.